Today is 2nd January 2024, and may I take again the opportunity before I proceed with this video to wish you all a very happy new year, a very happy 2024. May everything that you aspire and desire for yourselves and for your families and for your friends come true. In the meantime, of course, wars around the world continue in many places. Life for many people continues to be very difficult. Let us hope that those wars abate and we start to move forward towards a period of peace. But the wars do continue, and the purpose of this channel, and indeed of us at the Duran, is to a great extent now dominated by coverage of these wars, and it is to these wars that I'm going to now turn. And let me start again with the war in Ukraine. This is not because the other big war that is being fought. There are various wars being fought around the world, but it's not because the other big war which is being fought, the one in the Middle East, is not enormously important and significant. Probably certainly many more civilians have died in the fighting in Gaza than have died in Ukraine, for example. But it remains the case that in terms of geopolitical conflict, it is the war in Ukraine that remains the seminal one. If the Russians prevail in this war, as they show every sign of being about to do, then the geopolitical effect will be momentous. An increasing number of Western commentators are becoming nervous about precisely that development. And we can see it in the United States, but perhaps even more in Europe, the clear signs of nerves, of panic starting to grow. But let's first of all turn to what is actually happening in Ukraine, on the battlefields and elsewhere. Well, the big news yesterday was another colossal Russian missile and drone strike. And this was an extraordinarily sophisticated operation. It seems there were 4 waves of strikes. The first one took place with uranium-2 drones. I've noticed that the Ukrainians persist in referring to these drones as the Shahids, because of course they are based on the Iranian Shahid drone, but all the indications are that they're now mass produced in Russia itself, in this factory in Kazan, and is also some indications say that the Russians have tweaked these drones, that they've perfected and improved them in various ways, that they're no longer identical to the Shahid drones that the Russians were using earlier this year, for example. But anyway, whatever. The first was a wave of drone attacks that happened across Ukraine. Then there was a simply colossal missile strike, which was carried out, it seems, principally by Tupolev 95 bombers, allegedly 17 of them in flight at one and the same time, which does point to very large numbers of KH-101 missiles being launched. Supposedly 4 Tupolev 22M3 bombers were also in the air at one time, which suggests that there were missile strikes with KH-32 missiles as well. These are these big supersonic missiles, which the Ukrainians have said they are not able to intercept. Then there was a third wave of missile strikes, apparently from the north. And then following all that up, there was a 4th strike, again with uranium-2 drones. So an enormous strike happening all across Ukraine with various different types of missiles. Apparently, tactical aviation of the Russian Air Force was also involved, and they launched KH-31 missiles. These are primarily missiles that attack are designed to attack and destroy radar stations. And one suspects that something of that was going on as well. But of course, the most tantalizing piece of information is that allegedly something like a dozen Kinjal hypersonic missiles were also launched against Ukraine over the course of last night. Now, that would be, by some measure, the biggest, the heaviest use of Kinjal missiles in the war up to this point. Now, Kinjals have been launched against various targets in Ukraine at various times. One senses, and this is my own feeling, I mean, I might be wrong here, that again, the priority target for these Kinjal missiles was Kiev, the capital, which does seem to have been a major target of these combined drone and missile strikes. There is a film, I've seen it, of what the Ukrainians claim is a Kinjal tumbling into the sea, to the river rather, the Dnieper River. It might have been a Kinjal. I cannot possibly identify this particular missile. To the extent that I'm able to see it at all, it looks to me as if this missile is intact. So if it was a Kinjal, I'm guessing that it must have malfunctioned rather than been intercepted, as the Ukrainians are perhaps claiming. But who knows? Maybe it was a completely different kind of missile. Maybe it was an air defense missile falling to earth after it missed its target. I'm not going to try and speculate about that. But what I can say, and this I think is in some respects much more consequential, is that there is also another film which I have seen, which shows a subsonic KH-101 missile, one of the missiles launched from those Tupolev 95 bombers, flying over Kiev, and there is no sign of any attempt to intercept it. Now, that is surely very significant. It suggests that the Kinjals, if those that were launched against Kiev, and perhaps some of the other missiles as well, were specifically targeting Kiev's air defense system, built principally now, as I understand it, around the Patriot missile systems. And that the Patriot missile systems buckled and broke under this attack, that they weren't able to keep operating throughout the night, so that early in the morning, and this particular KH-101, you can see it overflying Kiev in what looks like daylight. It was therefore able to fly across Kiev unhindered by Ukraine's air defenses. And that does suggest that, if only temporarily, the Ukrainian air defense system, the Patriot air defense missiles around Kiev, must have suffered very significant damage. I say that because I cannot imagine that the Ukrainians would have allowed subsonic cruise missiles to fly over their capital, Russian cruise missiles, to fly over their capital unhindered in the way that KH-101 clearly and obviously was doing. So that tells us that this was indeed a devastating strike. Now, there's reports that metro stations have been closed in Kiev. There's been problems, by the way, with the flooding of some of the more newly built metro stations, but that's a historic problem. It has nothing to do with these Russian strikes. But anyway, there are reports that the metro system is closed down, that there's problems with energy supply in Kiev as well, that there's blackouts. There's said to be a reduction in the internet connectivity in Kiev. Again, I can't comment on all of this. I'm not there. And one is bound to get all kinds of discordant reports. There's also suggestions that some of this damage, some of these events, the blackouts, the problems with the internet, are not the result, the direct result of missile impacts on Ukrainian infrastructure. Rather, they are steps, presumably precautionary steps, taken by the Ukrainian authorities themselves in response to this missile strike. In other words, that they have switched off or turned down the internet, that they've imposed rolling blackouts, perhaps to conceal information from the Russians, that kind of thing. But anyway, it is clear that this was a huge strike, and it did do massive damage, and not just in Kiev, but across Ukraine as well. And to repeat again, in my opinion, obviously, the Russians are attacking Ukraine's military-industrial infrastructure. I mean, they've said that already. That is precisely, clearly what they are doing. They're launching missile strikes against Ukrainian factories, Ukrainian production facilities. They're also attacking warehouses, ammunition stocks, those sort of things. But the primary target of these attacks is Ukraine's air defense system. And there was that article that appeared a few days ago in the New York Times after the big Russian missile strike on the 29th of December about how Ukraine's air defense system is buckling. And we've seen this happen again. And I'm going to suggest that some of the information that we're getting, and I want to stress, as of this time, this is information that's coming from various reporters and bloggers, and also to some extent from Ukrainian authorities. The Russian Defense Ministry, up to the time of the making of this video, has not provided its own detailed account of this missile strike. But anyway, if these reports about heavy use of Kinjal missiles and also of strikes by Kh-31 missiles, anti-radar missiles, by tactical aircraft are true, then I'm going to suggest that what we see is perhaps a combined attack. The Kinjals being launched against the missile launchers, the Patriot missile launchers, and the other missile launchers of the various systems. And then the tactical fighters, perhaps, once the missile launchers are out of operation, homing in and attacking the radars as well. And of course, it is destroying the radars that is the most important part of an operation like this, because missiles can be manufactured much faster, apparently, than radars can. If you can destroy the radars, and by the way, the control centers for the radars, and to put it brutally, kill the radar operators, highly trained operators, then of course you are going to deal a bigger blow to the air defense system than you would simply do if you knocked out the launchers themselves. So there we go. Another massive missile strike, weakening further the Ukrainian air defense system. And we are now starting to get more reports in the Western media, sourced from Ukrainian sources, that the Ukrainians themselves are becoming increasingly concerned about the condition of their Western-supplied air defense system. We're hearing reports that Ukrainians are now saying that they are so short of air defense missiles, so short of air defense capabilities, that they're going to have to make before very long, unless they are supplied with many more missiles and launchers and radar sets, they're going to have to make a choice between husbanding what they can, which might mean, for example, allowing Geranium-2 drones and KH-101s to operate over large areas of Ukraine effectively unhindered, or alternatively, to go on trying to shoot down as many of these drones and missiles as possible, but running the risk that by doing so, they will be out of missiles entirely within a relatively short time. And of course, if the air defense system does finally crash and collapse in that kind of way, then the Russian Air Force is more free to operate over even larger, greater areas of Ukraine than it has been operating over up to now. So that, I think, is the ultimate purpose and objective of these missile strikes. And given the sort of panicky comments that we're starting to see, as I said, appearing in the Western media and being sourced in Ukraine itself, or clearly sourced from Ukraine itself, it does look as if the Russians are making steady progress in that direction. Of course, the unknown question is how many cruise missiles, Kinzhal missiles, and such missiles the Russians themselves have. And of course, this is something that I don't know, and I don't know that anybody actually knows, but there are plausible guesses. We've been told that the Russians have been stockpiling missiles. They do clearly seem to have very large numbers of stocks of Kinzhal missiles, many more than they did at the start of the special military operation in 2022, if they're able to launch a dozen of them at one time. But we don't know the extent of the Russian stockpile. There's various guesses. And of course, we don't know the extent of Russian production. Now, I'm going to come back briefly to the topic of Russian military production. About 10 days ago, Sergei Shoigu gave a statement to the Russian Defense Ministry Board in which he said that artillery ammunition had increased by 17.5 times since February 2022, when the special military operation began. And he didn't, of course, provide the base figure. And I pointed out that an article by the Jamestown Foundation said that at the time when the special military operation began in February 2022, the Russians were producing around 1 million shells a year. That was the Jamestown Foundation's, not my figure. And I said that if that was correct, then Russian production, if it has really increased 17.5 times, that would suggest a production rate of around 17.5 million shells a year, which, to be frank, even I find implausibly huge. And I did wonder whether perhaps Shoigu might be overstating things. And I pointed out that back in November, he said that production of shells, of artillery ammunition, had increased 5-fold. And that seemed more plausible than a production increase that was 17.5-fold. Well, the Russian Defense Ministry has now produced a standalone statement outlining production, the level of production increase. And this is what it says. It's very short, it's very tense. It says that since February 2022, the production of tanks has increased by 5.6 times, infantry fighting vehicles by 3.5 times, unmanned aerial vehicles by 16.8 times, and artillery ammunition by 17.5 times. So they are going out of their way to quote figures for artillery, to confirm that the increase of artillery ammunition that Shoigu was talking about is correct. And I have noticed that Putin himself, who clearly knows the true numbers, has been engaged in a rather complicated little game. He's been meeting with various important Russian officials. He met with Sergei Chemezov, the head of Rostec, which is the big industrial conglomerate in Russia that brings together the entire military-industrial complex. He asked Chemezov for figures for artillery production. Chemezov evaded an answer. But it's clear to me that Putin knows the number and that he's aching to try to disclose what it is, but that he's not able to say it himself because it's still a state secret, and the rest of the Russian military industrial security complex are nonetheless are trying to restrain Putin, in effect, from actually disclosing the exact number. But anyway, 17.5 times. Now, I'm going to make a guess. I'm going to suggest that there might be a way of reconciling Shoigu's previous figures, the one that spoke about a 5-fold increase, with the numbers that we're getting now, 17.5 times. And that's to suggest that probably there was heavy investment and expansion of production facilities throughout 2022 and 2023, and that this autumn the production as a result was able to surge because the new production capacity came on stream. And that might explain why we've seen this sudden leap in artillery ammunition production that Putin is talking about. Now, I'm also going to say this. I have read others suggest that the Jamestown Foundation number of 1 million shells a year is too high, which would be remarkable because the Jamestown Foundation has gone out of its way to downplay the extent of Russian artillery production, and that Russia was not producing 1 million shells a year at the beginning of 2022. It was producing more like 300,000 shells a year. Now, if that is correct, then a 17.5 times increase would mean that Russia is now producing around 5 million shells a year, which is still an enormous number, but perhaps a rather more plausible one than 17.5 million shells, which, if you take the Jamestown figure as the base one, was what one might get. I would point out that just a short time ago, a couple of months ago, the United States was saying that towards the end of the autumn of 2023, Russian artillery production had increased to 2 million shells a year. If we take 300,000 as the base number, and we accept Shoigu's claim of a 5-fold increase as of November, then that would bring us to something like 1.5 to 2 million shells, just saying. And of course, if the number of shells, the production of shells has increased further since then and is now running at a rate 17.5 times greater than on the 1st of January 2022, then perhaps we've seen a further surge and production is indeed running at around 5 million shells. Anyway, that's a slight diversion from the subject. But to return to the missile strikes, there doesn't seem to be any doubt that production of missiles has also increased very considerably. We don't know The extent of it, again, we don't have any baseline numbers. We don't know what the Russians were producing in terms of numbers of missiles at the start of 2022. But I've heard that they've increased production threefold. And we'll just have to see how long they can sustain this and what their ultimate intentions are. Now, before I finish discussing missile strikes, just to also quickly say that one particular new missile which did enter production in Russia last year has not been used so far in the special military operation. The Russians have carried out attacks with Kinzhal missiles, with KH-101 missiles, with Kalibra missiles launched from the Black Sea, and apparently several of those were also launched last night, with KH-31 missiles, with many different types of missiles, but they have not so far deployed or used against Ukraine their new Zircon hypersonic missiles, which are said to be faster and more advanced and more difficult to intercept even than the Kinzhals. Now, that's probably because these missiles have only just entered production. We will see whether or not at any point in time the Russians do decide to use these missiles. They have been installed in Russian frigates of the Admiral Gorshkov class. They're now being re-equipped with these Zircon missiles. They're primarily intended for anti-ship use, but like all Russian anti-ship missiles, they do have a land attack capability. We will see whether the Russians at any point decide to test them out. So there we go. Another huge Russian missile and drone strike against Ukraine. And President Putin, who recently went on a visit to the Vishnevsky military hospital in, I believe it's Moscow. He actually had a meeting there with various staff and soldiers who are receiving treatment for wounds. Anyway, President Putin made it very clear that more missile strikes of this kind should be expected. And Putin, by the way, had more to say about the attack, the attack by the Ukrainians on Belgorod. He answered questions from various servicemen. I have to say again that I got the impression that some of these questions were pre-prepared, but he was specifically asked about the attack on Belgorod, and he said that this was clearly intended to goad the Russians into launching attacks on civilian targets in Ukraine, but that the Russians would not let themselves be goaded into doing that. He said that for that reason, they will continue to launch attacks on military infrastructure. The exact words he said is these. He said, what happened in Belgorod is, of course, a terrorist attack. Why? Because of what they have done under the cover of two missiles. I think it was Olcha. They fired from multiple launch rocket systems. You as military people know what a multiple launch rocket system is. The weapon is not selective. It hits areas. The weapon struck right in the center of the city where people were walking before the new year. It was a targeted strike on the civilian population. Of course, this is a terrorist attack. This is Putin's words. There is no other way to describe it. Should we respond in kind? Of course, we can hit squares in Kiev or any other city, but there are children walking there, mothers and strollers. I understand because I am quite angry too, but I want to ask you, do we need to do this? Target the squares? And of course, the answer is that The answer is no. We strike with high precision weapons at locations where they make decisions, where military personnel and mercenaries gather, at other similar centers and military facilities. Above all, these blows can really be felt. We will continue to do this. So that was what Putin had to say about the Belgorod incident. Now, he did talk about other things. And of course, he spoke with the soldiers about social security issues, about their personal circumstances, about the state of the military hospitals in Russia. And by the way, this is not the place, but military medicine in Russia has a long and storied history going all the way back to the Crimean War. A lot of the most advanced progress in Russian medicine altogether and surgery and hospital treatments have tended to take place within the military medical center. But as I said, this is not a topic I'm going to discuss in this program. But anyway, he talked a lot about that, but he also talked about the conflict in the West, with the West, and the role that the conflict in Ukraine plays in that. And he did this in response to a question, and this is from a wounded soldier, Alexander Dublyanin, Comrade Supreme Commander-in-Chief. During the special military operation, we are liberating Russian territory. How do you feel about Western countries helping our enemy? And then Putin responded as follows. The point is that they are not helping our enemy. They are our enemy. They are solving their own problems with their hands. This is what it is all about. This has been the case for centuries, unfortunately, and continues to be the case now. And then he goes on to say, Putin went on to discuss the fact that there are people in the West who are talking about breaking up Russia, subdividing it into 5 parts, and that this remains their objective. Now, I want to just go back to those words. The point is that they're not helping our enemy. They are our enemy. Now, it's not such a long time not a long time from the time when Putin used to refer to Western countries as our partners in the West. And our partners are now straightforwardly identified as our enemy. He was careful to say that not everybody in the West is our enemy. To quote him again, there are people who sympathize with us and who are with us at heart. But there are the elites who think the existence of Russia, at least in its current state and size, is unacceptable. They want to disintegrate it. And I have no doubt at all that Putin actually believes this. This is not just Putin sounding off, trying to work people up. He is talking in this way because he generally feels this. He generally believes that the governments, the people he calls in the West, the elites, really do want to break up Russia. I've discussed how previously in his Defense Ministry board speech, he came across to me as more bitter and angry than he has ever been. And we see increasingly these feelings, which I suspect have been long suppressed, now rising to the surface. Putin today has come to feel that his long efforts, Russia's long efforts, going all the way back to the 1980s and even beyond, to try to come to some kind of terms with the West, to reach an acceptable mutual modus vivendi in the West, were not only never reciprocated by the West, but that the West was deceiving Russia and Putin himself throughout that time, that they were at all times Russia's enemies, and that their ultimate objective always was to achieve the breakup of Russia as they had achieved the breakup of the Soviet Union before then. And he actually says this has been the case for centuries, unfortunately, and continues to be the case today. Now, Putin every so often talks still about negotiations with the West, as do other Russian officials. I think in the West, people do need to start to understand how Putin himself has now come to feel about the West. He feels that he was deceived. He feels that the West was Russia's enemy all along. He feels that the Russian attempts to come to terms with the West simply opened up the way for the West to try to break up Russia. He says that this is what the whole purpose of the Ukrainian project was all along. They've been nurturing the Kiev regime for quite a long time, precisely to create this conflict. Unfortunately for us, they have achieved this. They started this conflict and are trying to achieve their objective, namely the task of fighting Russia with the help of Ukrainians. And any negotiation with Putin and with the Russians now is going to have to try and find some way to overcome this enormous mountain of resentment and anger and mistrust which exists in Russia now. I personally cannot imagine any kind of deal with the Russians being negotiated, be it by Donald Trump or anyone else, which will not be, from a Russian point of view, on very harsh terms indeed, both with respect to Ukraine and potentially with respect to the overall security situation in Europe. And if you have followed the interview with Dmitry Polyansky, Russia's ambassador to the UN, we took a decision, by the way, that we would publish that interview that I and Glenn Deason did together on YouTube after all. We took a, shall we say, a collective decision that we would publish it, so you can find it on YouTube. But you will see Polyansky mirroring a lot of that deep mistrust now of the West and of its intentions that Putin is now expressing. And I think I'm right in saying that Polyansky at one point talked about Russia working towards victory. He made it very clear that he does expect that the United States, the Congress, will eventually vote for aid for Ukraine. As far as the Russians are concerned, that will make absolutely no difference. If their assets are seized, that is not going to make any difference either. The Russians will press on until all their objectives are achieved, and they are now increasingly confident that achieved they will be. Anyway, that was Putin talking with wounded Russian soldiers, making again his own personal feelings clear, discussing the state of the war. He actually says again things about ammunition production, though he's careful, very careful, to stick with what is clearly the agreed line that the actual numbers of shells that Russia is producing will not be disclosed, even though one senses that he all but aches to do so. So, massive Russian missile strike. All the indications are more missile strikes coming. Undoubtedly, big increases in Russian missile production, a significant arsenal of Russian missiles still available to be launched, production presumably still rising, and strong hints that ammunition production, artillery ammunition production, is now soaring. Now, what about the situation on the battlefronts? Well, inevitably, since we've been through the holiday period, less information about what's going on there, but all the indications suggest more of the same, that the Russians are continuing their advances, both in the Avdiivka area. There's now clearly fighting going on within Avdiivka itself. In fact, it's been underway now for several weeks. And the Russians advancing both along the railway to the northwest of Avdiivka towards Ocheretenie. This appears to be a major priority, to advance to that particular village, take control of that village, gain the heights upon which this village is located. That will apparently in itself create the cauldron in Avdiivka itself. And also there's lots of reports of the Russians still fighting determinedly further south down the railway track and to the west, for Stepovoye, of which apparently they control around half, and trying to push towards Berdichi. The Ukrainians continuing to concentrate large numbers of men and troops around Berdichi, which, however, perhaps leaves them short of other troops to hold the Russians back as the Russians push northwards up the railway. So a difficult battle for Ukraine in Avdiivka. Undoubtedly the Russians taking losses, the Ukrainians also taking losses. It's important to stress again that the Russians can absorb losses more effectively than the Ukrainians can. We don't know the exact number of losses on either side. I still believe, by the way, that even in Avdiivka, given the much greater firepower that the Russians are able to bring to bear in artillery, in airstrikes, and the rest, that it is almost certainly the case that it is the Ukrainians who are continuing to suffer the heavier losses. Now, a couple of days ago, about 2 days ago, I mentioned that Zelensky himself had apparently visited Avdiivka, and I said that this was a courageous move by Zelensky and that it would have increased to some extent the morale of the soldiers at the 110th Brigade who are trying to defend Avdiivka. Well, perhaps inevitably, in the days after, a whole series of emails came cascading in from all sorts of people who pointed out that there were problems with the film of Zelensky in Avdiivka. They suggested that it might have been staged, that he never went to Avdiivka at all. They'd be far too dangerous for him to go, in fact, to Avdiivka. Now, I'm not going to comment on the truth of this. I'm going to continue to assume that Zelensky did indeed go to Avdiivka. That is the official line. I'm not personally in a position to contradict it. All I would say is that if he did not go to Avdiivka, then of course the soldiers of the 110th Brigade would presumably know that, and instead of lifting their morale, the story that he went there will have lowered it even further. But I'm not going to say more. I still think, on balance, that he probably did go. But, I'm prepared to be corrected on this. Elsewhere, intense fighting going on in the Bakhmut area. Lot of information about more Russian gains in the Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians have now released film of FPV drone strikes and shelling strikes on Russian troops in Bogdanovka, which provides film confirmation that the Russians are indeed in Bogdanovka. And it does look as if the Russians are indeed now definitely in the process of consolidating and clearing Ukrainian defenders from this village. Now, I understand some people who know more about these things than me tell me that Bogdanovka is essentially a suburb of Chasov Yar, in much the same way that Soledar, the small town to the north of Bakhmut, was a suburb of Bakhmut. And that if the Russians do indeed consolidate control of Bogdanovka, which is located very close to Chasov Yar, then the Russians are in a strong position to mount an attack on Chasov Yar itself. And there are other reports of more Russian advances west of Bakhmut, southwest of Bakhmut, in the Klishevka, Andreevka area. There are maps which show large areas that the Russians, fields that the Russians are supposed to have gained control of. All of that may be true. I'm not, again, in a position to provide exact verification of all of this. All I will say is that overall the Russians do seem to be continuing their advances. And there's been less news about what's going on in the enigmatic battle to the north around Liman and Kupiansk. But there is, again, considerable amount of information, some of it, much of it now from Ukrainian sources, speaking with some anguish about how the Ukrainians are being gradually pushed back in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, how the Russians are gradually regaining all the ground they lost over the course of the summer offensive. And the Russians, for their part, also continuing to talk about the isolated bridgehead that the Ukrainians have carved out for themselves in Krinky, on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. And there's been repeated Russian claims of more boats with Ukrainian reinforcements being sunk and more Ukrainian soldiers being killed there. Overall, the story remains the same. The Russians continuing to hold the initiative on every part of the battlefront, making progress in Avdiivka, in Bakhmut, probably in Marinka and Novomikhailovka as well, except, of course, again, I don't have fully up-to-date information about this. The Ukrainians on the defensive on every part of the front line, and short of men and ammunition and machines. And there has been a very strange, rather anguished article in the London Times about all of this, which has attracted a certain amount of attention. The point of the article is, the title of the article is that Europe aims to ramp up weapons to help Ukraine defeat Russia. And that gives this a fairly confident spin. But then you learn that it all comes from senior Whitehall source. That Britain and other European countries are cranking through the gears, trying to ensure they can help Ukraine win its war against Russia without the US should Donald Trump get into power. And then we have words like this. Ministers are desperately trying to ramp up manufacturing capabilities across the continent. This is British ministers trying to get the Europeans to increase weapons production to help Ukraine, so they can send weapons and ammunition to the front line and keep Vladimir Putin at bay for at least another year, irrespective of US support. And then they concede that Ukraine cannot win the war against Russia in 2024 because it does not have the manpower or the weapons for a big weapon battlefield breakthrough. It then, perhaps rather complacently, says that the Russians lack the strength to launch a major counteroffensive also. Well, that remains to be seen. I'm far less certain of this. And then it goes on to say, can continental Europe afford to fold just because Trump says no more US dollars? I think most realize that Putin can't be allowed to win, as consequences for European security are grave. And then there's lots of discussion about how the Europeans are supposed to be increasing production of weapons, although there's no evidence actually provided in this article that that is the case at all. And then we have the source, who I suspect, by the way, is Grant Shapps, the British Defence Secretary, but I might be wrong about this, saying 2024 isn't about big operational success. There's unlikely to be a big breakthrough this year. 2024 is about stretching Putin into 2025 and beyond, effectively calling his bluff and testing his resolve. Where is the evidence of Putin ever having bluffed? Again, I don't understand that, but anyway, that's what the London Times article goes on to say. And then it says, as the war drags on, there is nervousness across Europe that if Trump wins the US election, then US support for Ukraine could evaporate. And there's a rather brave statement, one not supported by what we hear from Ukrainian sources. Some Western officials believe Ukraine can continue to hold territory without the support of America. And we are told by a Western official, perhaps the same official, it's a lot easier to keep Ukraine defensively able to defend the gains it has made than it is to go on the offensive. I certainly, at least as far as that is concerned, I think we are pretty confident in the long run. And then there's talk about the Russian casualty numbers having increased, and then there's an admission that the Ukrainians are feeling themselves abandoned, looking on political disputes in the EU and the US. And the UK is the only one who is staying with Ukraine firmly. And then we have, of course, the deadly admission. The source, Whitehall source, perhaps Grant Shapps, perhaps someone else, added that the UK's weapons stockpiles are so diminished that the UK had nothing left, and it was better for them to lobby the Germans. So there it is. The UK is out of weapons. It has nothing more that it can give to Ukraine. No more Storm Shadows, no more artillery ammunitions, no more self-propelled howitzers, no more Challenger 2 tanks. The Challenger 2 tanks that were supplied, allegedly 3 of them have now been destroyed, and they've made absolutely no impact on the battlefields. But the British now engaged in a lobbying exercise across Europe, trying to get the Europeans to continue to supply weapons to Ukraine, to increase their own production, trying to get the Germans in particular to increase their own production, to send shells and tanks and all of those things to Ukraine, even as the prospects of more aid to Ukraine from the United States gradually fade away. Now, this is a fool's errand. Without the United States, without the United States' industrial capabilities, there is no possibility that Europe can take America's place, and no possibility either that, of course, Britain can do so. Britain is out of weapons. The German army is in a dire condition. European industry is fragmented. There is no conceivable way that the Europeans can replace the Americans. And I think everybody deep down knows this. But we see the desperate things that the British are getting up to. Let me repeat again a point I have made before. Speaking as a British citizen and a person who lives in London and in Britain, I find this attitude of the British government baffling and dangerous. Instead of trying to find a way out, a way to prevent a military debacle in Ukraine, we see Britain retreat into magical thinking, saying that even though Britain can't supply weapons, and the United States is probably also no longer going to supply weapons, we're going to try and find some way to pressure the Europeans, who, of course, we're no longer members of the EU anyway, but we're going to try and pressure the Europeans with all their problems to provide the Ukrainians with weapons in our place. And that is absurd. I mean, it is ridiculous. It is magical thinking, delusional thinking, almost as fantastic as that which we are continuing to get from President Zelensky at the moment. Even as his capital is being pummeled by Russian missiles, even as the Russians continue advancing on every part of the battlefronts, even as Ukraine is short of men and equipment, even as supplies of ammunition dwindle, President Zelensky gives interviews, as he's just done, by the way, to The Economist and other Western, primarily British publications now, talking about how Ukraine is going to win the war, how the objective is to blockade and recapture Crimea, how this will be the great epic victory which enables Ukraine to win the war. And this is so far out of touch with reality that, of course, in Ukraine itself, where people have to bear the brunt of the war, one is aware of the increasing disillusion. And for proof of that, one need go no further than that very same article in the London Times that I was talking about, the one in which the London Times, based on Whitehall sources, talks about the British telling the Europeans that they must go on providing increasing production of shells, tanks, aircraft, missiles, and all of that, even if the Americans pull out, because, of course, we can't let Putin win in Ukraine, even if Britain itself has nothing that it can actually offer. Anyway, this article in the London Times tells us what the mood in Ukraine currently is. And this is what it says. Mikhailo Chapliga, a political commentator and former vice ombudsman of Ukraine, said he believed most people in Ukraine want a truce, but were, quote, afraid to admit it to themselves. He said, this is Chapliga, there was an atmosphere of, quote, total mistrust and fear in Ukraine, and that anyone who dared to think of a truce would immediately become, quote, an outcast and a traitor. One Ukrainian former official, we not tell which one, said that President Zelensky was losing support in Ukraine, and that although the West was saying that Ukraine should not give up, there was no war strategy, and men and women were being sent to the front line to die. So that's the reality. That is the reality in Ukraine today, according to this article in the London Times. And yet the London Times continues to tell us that there's all this talk still in London, in Whitehall, complacent assumption that Ukraine can hold the line even without the Americans, that they can continue fighting, that they can keep the Russians at bay throughout 2024. And in the meantime, even if Britain can't help, the Europeans must. They must increase production. They must increase shell production and artillery production, armoured vehicle production. And of course, when we talk about the Europeans, as the article again makes it very clear, the people who must do all of that are, of course, the Germans. So, magical thinking in Britain, bearing no relation to the realities in Ukraine, almost as fantastic as that of President Zelensky himself. And we have more examples of magical thinking in other parts of the British media. There's an article today in the Financial Times, and it's by a gentleman whom I have no previous experience of, Simon Hinrichsen, and it says that seizing Russian reserves is the right thing to do. And it comes up with a new, though I say new, I suspect it's becoming an increasingly widespread theory, legal theory, justifying the seizure of frozen Russian assets. This is that these assets are going to be seized in preparation for a reparations bill that is going to be presented to Russia, presumably once it has lost the war in Ukraine. And it talks about reparations at length, and it compares the size of the Russian assets to the kind of reparations that have been demanded of defeated countries in the past, of France and Germany after defeats that they have suffered. And it says that, this war of aggression that the Russians are fighting is a blatant violation of international law. It must be punished, and reparations are the way to do that. Well, this article is interesting in the Financial Times because the thread, the response from people who have read it on the thread is absolutely scathing. Somebody said that it read like an article written by a 13-year-old. And for once, I find myself in agreement with this. Reparations, by definition, are something which a defeated country agrees to pay following a war which it has lost as part of the peace agreement or treaty which is agreed after that war. This is, in no conceivable sense, seizing Russian assets cannot constitute some kind of an advance on reparations payments. First of all, the Russians have not lost the war. On the contrary, they're winning it. And secondly, there is absolutely no precedent for seizing assets to use them to pay reparations without the agreement of the country which is agreeing to pay those reparations. Indeed, what is actually being proposed, what is in fact being proposed, is seizing assets in order to fund the war, to continue funding the war, which presumably, once it results in victory, is going to result in those funds being treated as reparations. I mean, the idea, legally speaking, is nonsensical. But it is another example of the magical thinking that I've just been talking about. The Americans, the administration is apparently leaning to this idea. One can see why the British are leaning towards it. The appearance of this article and this outlandish legal theory gives me, makes me think, and in fact reinforces a belief I've actually had, that this particular idea of seizing these Russian assets originates in London rather than in Washington. That as the British sense that funding from the United States, that Congress is unlikely to provide funding, desperate to keep this war going, desperate to see Putin defeated, that they're now coming up with all these bizarre ideas, getting the Europeans to shoulder the burden of providing Ukraine with weapons, and trying to persuade the Americans with some success, and the Europeans so far with less success, to confiscate, to seize, to steal, if you like, these assets, and coming up with these bizarre theories about reparations in order to justify doing it. I have to say that I am deeply worried, deeply concerned about Britain, for Britain, when I see articles like this, the one that's just appeared in the London Times, and the accompanying one that has appeared in the Financial Times. It shows the extent to which parts of the British elite have become utterly obsessed, monomaniacally obsessed with this war, and the dangerous places that this obsession is leading them to. Anyway, there we are. Just to bring all of these discussions back to a sense of reality, I discussed earlier the increases in Russian ammunition production. Rosstat, which is Russia's statistical agency, has now come forward and has said that Russian GDP growth has been underestimated in the last 2 years. In 2021, Russian GDP growth was more likely 5.9% than 5.6%. 2021, of course, was a year of recovery from the pandemic. But perhaps more importantly, it has cut significantly its calculation for the extent of the recession that Russia experienced last year. It said that the contraction in 2022 was 1.2%, not 2.1%. And the economics ministry, the Russian economics ministry, is now saying that, in fact, the inflation spike that Russia is going through is not a symptom, is not an indicator of an economy that's overheating. It is the product of particular factors, one-off factors that are playing out this year, that the economy, that the Russian economy is now on a path of sustainable growth, and that the previous calculations about the growth capacity of the Russian economy have been underestimated. Now, that may be true or not, we will have to see, but certainly there doesn't seem to be any sign that the Russians are losing their capacity to maintain production of weapons. And of course, as I've discussed many times, the Russian military is getting bigger and stronger all the time. And at the moment, Ukraine's forces are weakening and they're struggling to hold the front lines. And, well, we saw from that article in the London Times how bleak and fraught the mood in Ukraine has now become. So, that's my summary about the war in Ukraine. A massive Russian missile and drone attack, further Russian advances on the front line. All the indications are that we're going to see more and more of this over the course of the year, over the course of 2024. And I've noticed that Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chair of Russia's Security Council, is now saying that 2024 is that the priority for Russia over the course of 2024 is to see the ending of the Kiev regime, as he calls it, in other words, regime change in Ukraine. And it does seem to me that Medvedev at least seems to think that there is a real prospect of Russia winning the war in 2024. And we've seen from Putin how bitter and angry and mistrustful of the West he, for one, has become. And he's gone on to say that the Russians, he went on to say, in fact, to those Russian soldiers at this hospital, that no, yes, Russia does not seek indefinite war. I mean, there is a finite point to this, but that finite point does not include Ukraine. He says in Ukraine itself, the Russians must achieve all their objectives. So there we go. Now, there is that other war, which is also going on, the one in the Middle East. And here we're getting very interesting signals, because over the weekend, the New Year weekend, surely timed for the New Year weekend, we got information about a significant withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. And the Israelis announced that most of the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, most of the heavily equipped troops will now be withdrawing from Gaza. We're told that the most difficult, the most important part of the military operation in Gaza has now been successfully achieved, and that what remains in Gaza is basically a mopping up operation, though one which will last for many, many, many months, but it doesn't require the same heavy equipment and presumably bombing of Gaza that we have seen up to now. And all of this is accompanied by confirmation from the Pentagon that the Gerald Ford, the aircraft carrier, which has been steaming around the eastern Mediterranean for some time now, that it is returning to the United States, that it has completed its mission, that this is a routine return of the Gerald Ford to the United States. There will be other warships to take its place. There's an amphibious warfare carrier there, powerful warship, but not analogous to a nuclear-powered strike carrier such as the Gerald Ford is. But whatever, the Gerald Ford itself and presumably its escort warships are going to return to the United States, which suggests a very significant reduction of military force by the United States, deployed by the United States in the Middle East. And so what does all this mean? Well, I suspect that there has continued to be this ongoing furious debate in the United States. I've spoken in the previous programs about how it seemed increasingly as if a missile strike of some kind against the Houthis in Yemen was in the course of preparation. We've also had people like John Bolton advocating a missile strike on Iran, a major missile strike on Iran. But there's clearly other people, cooler heads in Washington, who are saying under no circumstances must we expand the war. Expanding the war would be an absolute disaster for the United States. And it seems that these wiser counsels, which they are, by the way, have prevailed. And we've seen the return of the Gerald Ford to the United States. And we're also seeing this major pullback of Israeli troops from Gaza, despite the fact that, as far as I can see, the mission is far from completed. Hamas is still there in Gaza. It still holds most of its hostages. It's still able to launch rockets into Israel itself. As far as I can see, its tunnel network remains largely unscathed. And my overall opinion is that what has come together is two factors: the embarrassments that the United States has suffered at the General Assembly and in the Security Council, discussed by Ambassador Polyansky in that interview Glenn Deason and I recently did with him. And that has alarmed some people in the State Department and also worry about the effect on the electoral arithmetic if this war visibly continues into 2024 in the run-up to the election, and worries that that might continue to fracture the Democratic Party's electoral coalition. So the United States not prepared to agree to a ceasefire resolution. That would be now a humiliation, but trying to do the next best thing, reduce the level of the fighting in Gaza as far as possible, de-escalate in the Middle East, hope that the media will lose interest in the war, that people will lose interest in the war as it reduces to a more low intensity level, and that this will then clear the way forward for the president, for the Democratic Party to conduct his campaign in the election. Now, it may work. It's not impossible that it will work. But it's important to stress that this leaves absolutely nothing in the Middle East resolved. The situation in Gaza remains as terrible as always. Maybe there's not going to be more shelling and more bombing, but there's going to continue to be fighting there. There is a humanitarian catastrophe still ongoing there. It's difficult to think, though, that most people in the Middle East will not see this pullback by Israel from Gaza as a sign of weakness by Israel and by the United States, rather than as a sign of strength, as a sign that the US is on the retreat, and they will likely interpret the withdrawal of the Gerald Ford in a similar sort of way. And already one can see signs of dissension in Israel when Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to conduct a press conference. His defense minister and another top official stayed away, and it's difficult to see this as anything other than as evidence that there's disagreement within Israel about the direction of policy from this point onwards. And given that these moves will most probably be construed as a sign that the US is on the retreat, I would have guessed that what we're likely to see is an escalation of attacks from the other side, not an increase in them. More attacks on US bases in Syria and in Iraq, more fighting in the Red Sea between the Houthis and the rather disorganized international coalition that is gathered there, more of that kind of thing. It seems to me that a much more certain way to de-escalate the tension in the Middle East would be through the simple and clear-cut device of agreeing a ceasefire in Gaza. But of course, that now is politically very difficult for the United States to do, and that is why the administration has instead come up with this new plan to de-escalate to the extent that they can without actually agreeing to a ceasefire as such. It seems to me that the potential risks in this are very great, but anyway, that is what the administration has decided to do. We will see whether that works. I will say that any reduction in the intensity of the fighting in Gaza must be welcome, especially if it results in more humanitarian access. But let me finish again by saying that halfway solutions, especially in the Middle East, don't look to me like being solutions of any kind at all. They're more likely to create more problems going forward than they are to solve those problems. And It's necessary instead for someone in Washington to finally grasp that fact and to move towards that ceasefire. But it seems that the administration and the political system in the United States are incapable of doing those things. Anyway, we will see where all this goes and what happens next, but this is where I end my program, my first program for 2024 today. Let me remind you once more that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop where you'll find all the amazing things that you will get there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. But last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day, and I'll be back tomorrow.